A silver American Eagle tour bus was in our future, and a long series of overnight trips crisscrossing the USA in pursuit of the Scorpions. We were the special guests in a 3-act show with a good chunk of time to develop a connection with an audience who were ripe for conversion. It's taken a while for European tour buses to catch up with their American cousins, and back in 1982, there was simply no comparison. The American Eagle was like a whorehouse on wheels. Bus life soon established its routine. The front lounge was misery, where Rod plotted, played cards, and was grumpy, and where Steve watched hours of videos. The back lounge was naughty, where Clive, Davy, and Adrian disposed of a lot of vodka. I flipped from one to the other and found the whole process a tiny bit frustrating. The Number of the Beast tour was when we did most things on the road for the first time. As time went on, it became clear to me that the novelty would soon wear off. The joy of getting brainlessly mashed every night just to get through the next pointless 18 hours soon paled into a hopeless numbness until the next show brought light and life to our world. The biggest factor that changes Saturday night out with the lads in a band to every Saturday spent in rehab or therapy is money and drugs. Access to either can seriously damage your mental health. We didn't have much money, actually. I don't think any of us had a credit card between us. But everyone wanted to give us drugs. Lots of them, and all for free. I'm loath to attribute drugs as the root cause of Clive's growing estrangement from Steve. But slowly, yet surely, niggles and arguments crept in backstage. Clive's luggage was an issue. Clive got more luggage. Steve jumped on the drum riser, telling him to play faster. Clive slowed down. The front of the bus became the front line, and the back of the bus turned into a bunker for the bad boys. They had such a terrific on-stage row in Kiel Auditorium, St. Louis, that Clive went into slow motion in protest. I didn't help matters by bringing out a pillow and 2 blankets and pretending to go to sleep in the middle of the stage in protest. I thought that was a bit out of order, Steve said. Fair enough, I replied. Once the rot starts in a band, it's like a dog with a bone, always there, waiting to be gnawed on. We were too busy to talk about it, too close to escape from it, and too tired one minute and full of adrenaline the next to be rational about it. The juggernaut rolled on, but one wheel was wobbling. Chapter 15. On the Bandwagon. And oh boy, did we move on. The word was out in the USA, and halfway through our Scorpions tour, we returned briefly to the UK to headline the Reading Festival. Might I be permitted to pinch myself? I must be dreaming. 1 year before, I was in debt in a failing band and standing under a lamppost, being offered an audition at the very same festival we were just about to headline. We looked a very different band to the fresh-faced boyishness on the back cover of Run to the Hills. There was an air of confident lunacy about us. The Faustian pact we had made was still a one-way street, all in our favour, oh yes, and my neck was feeling a lot better, thank you very much, just in time for us to scramble on a jumbo jet and resume operations in the USA. By now, we were genuinely snapping at the heels of the Scorpions. The bus rolled on and we went from West Coast to St. Louis, and it was time to begin with Rob Halford and Judas Priest, and the combination was one of the hottest tours in the country. Priest were incredibly reliable and their sound engineer was phenomenal. Actually, the last time I'd seen him was in a hot tub in Michigan. Life really did seem to be going in ever-increasing circles. We had the aura of otherworldly beings, at least in our universe. Without realizing it, circumstances led the rest of humanity to assume that we were rock stars. Deep down, when I was aged 16, I thought it would be an amazing experience to be a rock star and do all those things that are read about in the newsprint broadsheet weeklies. Rock stardom was lived vicariously by journalists, as envious as they were pretentious in many cases. It was a seductive and easy pit to fall into, and made easier if your will was addled by industrial quantities of coke and hash. What saved Maiden from this depressing fate was our gradual organisation into an unplanned triumvirate of me, Steve Harris, and Rod Smallwood. We each offered different ingredients to the overall pie, and as we gained knowledge of each other's contributions, we started to fiddle about with each other's domains. Not exactly a democracy, but at least a sort of guided autocracy. There is a reluctance on the part of bands to admit that they are not democracies. The only member of a band who is quite happy to say, "Of course we are a democracy," is the local dictator, because he knows he will never be contradicted. The lesser beings, talented as they may be, have to put up with the largesse of the main man. And that's just the way that it is. It doesn't have to be unpleasant. The reason so-called supergroups so often fall short of expectations is because the monumental egos, when taken out of context and placed in close proximity, do not act as a force multiplier. Imagine putting Napoleon, Hitler, and Stalin in a room together, setting aside any political differences, and just observe whether any sensible decision could be made to advance a common cause. The interpersonal chemistry required to sustain a global rock group over many decades is nothing short of a miracle. Too many chiefs, not enough Indians. All Indians and no chiefs. One chief and rebellious Indians. Stupid chief, clever Indians. All are doomed to fail. The temperature of the porridge has got to be just right. The American tour concluded. All was well in the world. Rod was in his element, brimful of statistics, head counts, merchandise dollars per head, and countless other measures of our success in prizing open the vault of the biggest music market in the world. As the weather turned autumnal, we bent nature to our will and flew south for the winter to the land of Oz, which, after the gratuitous insanity that was touring the USA, was very much more Anglo-Saxon, but equally painful. The flight, of course, was lengthy. Like 99% of the rest of the world, we flew with our knees up in our chest in economy class and stood in bleary-eyed line to be searched for peanut butter and any other food products that might silently take over the Australian ecosystem overnight. Apart from a cartoon strip dedicated to their existence, I could not for the life of me see what possible point there was in the continuing existence of funnel web spiders. There are perfectly inoffensive English spiders that could do the job, but not kill you as you take a crap in the loo. In the dunny. The King's Cross district of Sydney had a club called the Mansell Rooms, a good rock and roll dive. I had my drink spiked with speed and stayed up for 48 hours, wired out of my skull. I called a doctor because I had a show that night and I couldn't actually speak after staying up and rabbiting 10 to the dozen uncontrollably. I drank lots of water, slept all day, got up half an hour before the show and reset the gyros that kept my voice upright. Thank God it worked. 23 is an amazing age for the immune system. The girl on reception in the hotel was very friendly, and so we found ourselves on a boat in Sydney Harbour, with all the crew, cold beers, darkness, the harbour bridge lit up and twinkling on the dappled black water. We took a small yellow inflatable dinghy out into the harbour, and a lot of beer. A shark's fin appeared a few yards away, and then another. My rowing experience came in handy. Nothing in childhood is ever wasted. Things had moved on from the days of the gold lame jockstrap. In fact, they had become more transparent. Steve was now wearing a pair of black plastic trousers, tights basically, and they looked like they'd been sprayed on. Trouser envy took over, and I found the same type in Paris, but in red. The singer of UFO, Phil Mogg, was once asked about his trousers and volunteered the comment, "Yeah, underpants are naff." I think we all subscribed to the same tailor. Not to be outdone, Clive wore a silver spandex skin-tight onesie. Line-up photographs, viewed at crotch level, resembled a vegetable shop, well stocked with red peppers, aubergines and silver skin onions. Our onstage trousers eventually wore out. Mine, in particular, had the PVC coating worn away by friction with the microphone stand, leaving a rather horror movie special effect blistered finish. While strolling around Sydney, I spotted the very thing in a shop window: 2 pairs of Harlequin bally tights for blokes. To date, I'd been using a pair of white boxing boots from Lonsdale. Steve's personal helper, Vic Vella, had left them in front of an electric fire to dry out after they were soaked in one of our sweat-stained theatre shows. One boot survived, but the other parted company with its slightly shriveled sole. Moments before going on stage, I made the fateful discovery. The only solution was the universal panacea of gaffer tape. I taped around the top and bottom of the front of the foot, and it worked just fine. When the tape on the bottom wore out, I just added more. I got fan mail about my boots. One girl wanted to know where she could find the boot with the black stripe on it. Well, the answer now was in the dustbin. Newly suited and basketball booted, my next appointment was the check-in desk for the flight to Tokyo. I was on my way to the land of samurai and sumo, bullet trains, temples, and Mount Fuji, and electronic gadgets and video game nirvana. Maiden were already big in Japan. The band had a live EP, Maiden Japan, which obviously was a pun on one of the greatest live albums of all time, Deep Purple's Made in Japan. When I stepped off the plane and went to immigration at Tokyo Narita Airport, a couple of things struck me immediately. First, it was unbelievably clean. There are hospitals in the UK that could only aspire to the antibacterial regime clearly prevalent in Japanese transport hubs. Secondly, this was the first country I had ever visited where not just the language, but the alphabet itself was alien. The latter problem was solved by a combination of bilingual forms and traffic lights. Whilst awaiting bags arriving in the operating theatre sterility of the luggage carousel, you simply pressed a button and a green or red light directed you to a stern customs guard. Very politely, your luggage was searched with white gloves, and very politely you were sent on your way. The words "live at Budokan" marked a band as a worldwide phenomenon, and being big in Japan was so sought after that an American band called Riot named their album Narita after the international airport. Gatwick or Heathrow Terminal 5 doesn't have quite the same ring. The concert organisation ran like a precision chronometer. We travelled on bullet trains to the shows, and these ran with a reliability and timekeeping that must have commenced with the ticking of the first atomic clock. For all their legendary status, the actual concert halls were very modest theatres. We were not at Budokan level yet, but even Budokan is not quite as exotic when you realise it's just a medium-sized gymnasium that gets used as a martial arts centre. And the phrase "big in Japan" is also very misleading. The Japanese have 2 entirely separate chart systems, the international and the domestic. Selling 50,000 records would catapult you handsomely towards the top of the international chart. 50,000 records on the domestic chart would barely register. It was rare for an international artist to make a domestic chart breakthrough, as, for example, Sheena Easton did. Maiden were young and growing. It was 5 p.m. Tokyo time, and we had finished the soundcheck. The show would be over by 8. They started very early to ensure minimum disruption of the school or working day that followed, or so I assumed. There was an eerie silence before we went on, just the occasional cough or shuffling of feet. There was no support band. Such things were not the norm. The theatres were 1,200 to 2,500 seats in the main, and the wood and carpets muffled the sound, although I remember the Osaka Festival Hall as being just the right construction for a mix of ambient sound and non-reflectivity. Blue uniformed ushers would patrol the aisles, lest a foot should stray or emotion get the better of obedience. At the front of the audience, there was no barrier. There was, instead, an invisible Japanese force field. It was a piece of string between us and the crowd. We, of course, were down the front edge of the stage, Steve machine-gunning with his bass and staring them out with crazy eyes. Every so often, one of the crowd would crack, shaking in a frenzy on the spot. Emotion would take over, and they'd step out of line, then back as if struggling against a moral tractor beam that pulled them towards the obedient masses. Like a shot, a little blue-suited man delivered a swift blow with a rolled-up newspaper to the poor chap, who snapped back to his seat, head bowed, arms by his side, looking like a robot that had just been switched off. In later years, I discovered the Japanese expression often used in schools to describe an individual who was overly individualistic. The nail that stands up is always hammered down. We were coming to the end of 187 shows, plus writing and recording an album, all in under a year. We were to spend a very brief spell in the UK at Christmas, then straight into writing and recording another album and starting another enormous tour. I had traversed the globe, east to west and north to south. All my wildest fantasies had been fulfilled. #1 album, big in Japan, US tours, headlining the Reading Festival. My hotel room was covered in the spare junk of the intercontinental rock star. Suitcases never big enough for the T-shirts acquired. Fake samurai swords to take home, along with gadgets, posters, books, and a stereo system, which I played super loud in my room to the annoyance of anyone sleeping next door, usually Rod Smallwood. After the last show, we got very drunk. I was mixing hot sake with cold beer chasers. Back at the hotel, I was hungry. Room service had stopped for the night. I crawled on my hands and knees down a hotel corridor till I found a used room service tray with 2 old bread rolls and a slab of butter. I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror by the lift. There is a William Blake painting, Nebuchadnezzar, which is on the cover of Atomic Rooster's album, Death Walks Behind You. The king's face looks out in horror as he realizes what he is becoming. He's transforming slowly into a beast. That painting was my reflection. What has happened to you for the last year, I asked myself, and what can you do to stem the insanity? I checked if my foot was morphing into a beast's. It wasn't. Not yet, anyway. There was still time, and I did have 2 bread rolls in hand. Chapter 16. New Battery. Christmas was a strange affair. Life not on the road. I owned a house now, a small new-build terrace in West London, the spoils of war, and having a #1 album. Rod Smallwood came round for dinner. His Christmas present was an ornate box to hold playing cards, because he was quite fond of gambling, but only in the right circumstances. The cards came out. After he won, hands down, he pocketed the cash from everyone at the dinner and then left. It was, I suppose, his managerial instinct. If you invite a saber-toothed tiger round for a cup of tea, don't be surprised if it eats you. It's not to be taken personally, it's just what saber-toothed tigers do. The next 3 albums and tours equated to the next 5 years of my life. All of it, though, would be done without Clive Burr, let go at the end of the Number of the Beast tour. It wasn't about luggage, and it wasn't about partying or girls, because anybody and everybody was guilty of that at some time or another. Artistic differences would be to overstate his creative input. The closest phrase I could get would be self-fulfilling, irretrievable disagreements. The breakdown of the relationship between a drummer and bass player is pretty fundamental, especially if the bass player also happens to be the principal songwriter and bandleader. Clive always regarded the Maiden setup with a jaundiced eye, even as he was held in high regard by the fans. I loved his drumming feel, essentially because his sweet spot was of the big band swing time variety, that guys like Ian Pace of Deep Purple had going for them. Where we didn't see eye to eye was in the intricate and often eccentric fills and time signatures dreamt up by Steve. Their personalities were increasingly on a collision course. Steve was shy offstage, but aggressive and precise onstage. Clive was Mr. Outgoing offstage, but often Mr. Approximate when it came to precision onstage. Throw the whole melange into a pot, and it got messier and messier throughout America. By the end, Steve took me to one side and said, "He's got to go. I can't fucking take it any longer." On the one hand, Steve and I had come a long way since near fisticuffs in Newcastle City Hall. On the other, I would be sad to see Clive go, but things had clearly been bubbling under for a long time. We entered a whole new world with a leap of faith and a new drummer. Nico McBrain was a professional musician and had known almost nothing else for his working life. Technically, he was totally overqualified for us. The drum parts to date were busy, but not a problem for Nick in the slightest. He'd toured with a French band, Trust, already, and when they supported Maiden, I'd watched him play from the side of the stage. Steve and the rest of the band were Trust fans, having toured with them previously. Being a frustrated skinsman myself, I love watching drummers. They evolve a personal movement style over the years, which I find fascinating. Some sit body upright, with their arms flailing like a syncopated spider as the wooden sticks whirl around their head. Some drum as if in a trance, whilst others act more like madmen trying to batter their way out of a prison cell, and others still look like accountants until you close your eyes and listen rather than look. Nico was a dead ringer for Animal from the Muppets. His face would light up as he started to play, and the drums would each receive their individual encouragement vocally, very similar, in fact, to Steve's nocturnal mumblings on the Number of the Beast. When cymbals were struck, and Nick has always liked to spank a nice piece of metal, they were always treated to special intimacies. Fuck off, fuck off, fuck off, fuck off. Over the years, we've considered gagging him in the studio. But live, there is simply no concealing the musical Tourette's that comprises the McBrain damage. His volatility extended to his long-suffering drum roadies. A few months after he joined, I was woken up by a commotion outside my hotel window in San Sebastian, Spain, where Maiden were doing pre-production rehearsals. There was Nico's drum roadie, sitting in a fountain, clutching a brick and shouting, "Kill me! Kill me now!" Nico's advice had sound therapeutic value. Fuck off and don't be a twat. Otherwise, it was a very pleasant Sunday evening in the town square. We enlisted the services of Steve Gadd to look after Nico. Steve was also a drummer and had quite a distinguished career with the band Charlie. He understood the mania that inhabits the drummer's brain. But for him, it manifested in a gently ironic and very relaxed view of the universe. It was as if he had some invisible duck on his head and all the water thrown on it just rolled off its back. Eventually, Steve got time off for good behaviour and became our most trusted assistant tour manager. In the new year of 1983, the band decamped to the island of Jersey, together with Martin Birch. We took over Le Chalet Hotel in its entirety. Sadly, it no longer exists. It's been erased from the hillside on which it perched, either that or it fell off. For the next 2 albums, it was our writing home. It had a bar that was open 24 hours a day, so help yourself, and a small ballroom which we turned into a rehearsal room to write, eat, sleep and breathe music. The internet did not exist, and neither did the laptop or mobile phone. There was one television and a pool table. The Atlantic gales blew against the windows that faced a storm-lashed 5-mile beach below. At night, the Corbière lighthouse shone eerily, and by day, if the tide was out, you could scramble up the causeway, strewn with driftwood and seaweed. I couldn't help but think of Van de Graaff Generator's masterpiece, A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers. With the image of Blake's Nebuchadnezzar and my 2 bread rolls firmly in mind, I decided to take my fencing kit with me. My mental salvation from rock and roll torpor would be to dust off my foils and get stuck into some training. Incredibly, there were 2 fencing clubs on Jersey. I put a training plan together and showed up. Fencing interested Martin. One evening, he recounted his struggle with the music business. An engineering prodigy, marked for greatness, and with early greatness achieved, he was dragged off on tour with Deep Purple as a live sound engineer. He was a black belt in Shotokan karate, and he would take his kit everywhere on tour with Purple and train as an antidote to the madness. He would talk of the power of one blow. At one point, he came very close to quitting music altogether to study karate full-time in Japan. I was busy writing. My little 4-track cassette recorder held a few ideas, and I'd started a writing partnership with Adrian that would provide Maiden with a seam of material to line up as potential singles or radio tracks. Japan had nibbled away at me. I'd bought a copy of Miyamoto Musashi's philosophical The Book of 5 Rings. Touted as the go-to text for business warriors, it was written as a treatise on combat, life and art by one of Japan's most legendary ronin. Musashi's life has been serialized and put into an epic novel, and as a character he impinges on much of Western movie culture, from The Magnificent Seven to Clint Eastwood and the outlaw Josie Wales. The Japanese ultranationalist Yukio Mishima became obsessed by him and caused mayhem when, as one of Japan's most revered poets, he disemboweled himself and was decapitated by a faithful assistant during a failed coup d'etat. The inspiration for our song Sun and Steel came from one of Mishima's best-known novels, but the lyrics are not about Mishima, they are about Musashi. The song's short and quite simple. I kept the guitar riff straightforward because I'm not very good at guitar. Adrian plays it far better than I could have imagined. Ross Halfin turned up and we stood on rocks by the lighthouse, windswept and trying not to look freezing cold. Flashbang wallop, what a picture, what a photograph. Steve rolled out the Trooper after whistling a happy tune into a Sony Walkman, and I pinched a verse from the English hymnal for the first lines of Revelations. The opening drum sequence to Where Eagles Dare I can take partial responsibility for. It was based on Cozy Powell's intro to Stargazer by Rainbow, although it's the effect, rather than the notes played, that I was after. We toyed with different things, and I mentioned that there was a terrific tom-tom fill I remembered on an obscure hit from a guitarist called Gordon Giltrap. Oh yeah, Heart Song, that was me. Of course it was. Classic McBrain drumming. We took that fill and infilled it with triplets before it goes into the main riff. The bass drum part was extreme. It was like Woody Woodpecker having an epileptic beak attack. "You can't play that on a single bass drum, it needs a double pedal," Nico declared. Well, I was inclined to agree with him, but that wasn't the point. I bet you Ian Pace could do it. The work rate required to get his single foot to play the pattern was extraordinary. To his eternal credit, he worked at it for days, and he succeeded. "Fuck me, I'm glad that's done. We ain't ever going to do that live, fucking hell." We ended up opening the show with it every night. Oops. Rod Smallwood showed up and we all drank heavily. Apart from writing and rehearsing, there was not a great deal to do. Steve organised a pool tournament and arranged for an enormous trophy. There was one rock night per week in a desolate pub down by the beach, and when we turned up, we instantly doubled the attendance figures. In the bar, arguments ensued and questions of philosophy were answered. The meaning of life, according to Rod, was simple. Pride and ego. Pride to do your very best, and ego to take it that bit further. I thought there might be more to it than that. Martin had also pitched in, and Marvin made an appearance as he started standing on the furniture, muttering, "Death, one blow," and striking one-legged karate poses. We thought it might be a good contest to see who would win between karate and fencing. I fetched my foil, and we moved the furniture away from the bar. Rod had moved on from philosophy to physics. Oh, I was so immensely strong I could lift 5 navvies on the end of a shovel. Combat preparations momentarily ceased as Martin and I both looked askance. "How does that work?" "That's bollocks," we said. "No, it's not. It's bloody physics, that's what it is," said Rod. I failed physics O-level, and Rod studied architecture at Cambridge, but clearly not bricklaying. Anyway, Martin and I squared off. He bowed, and I gave a fencing salute. After a bit of unsteady toing and froing, he unleashed a roundhouse kick that sent the bar stools flying. I stopped toing and froing and knocked over a plant pot, and somewhere in the midst of all this two bulls in a china shop chaos, the point of my foil had nestled comfortably in the middle of his chest. "Ah, Ippon," Martin said, bowing deeply. The only injuries were caused by collisions with furniture. I think we decided, on balance, that the furniture won in the end. More Atlantic gales, the bedrooms were damp and draughty, still life, quest for fire, and, of course, Dune came from Steve's muse. Actually, Dune wasn't Dune at all. The author, Frank Herbert, didn't like heavy metal and caused us no end of problems, so the name was changed to Tame a Land. Flight of Icarus began life in a toilet. Adrian was fond of playing guitar in bathrooms. He liked the ambience from the tiles, and whilst he was noodling away, I heard a sequence of chords and started singing along to them. The chorus of Flight of Icarus just started flying like an eagle as a result. I quickly realised that we potentially had a song under 4 minutes that could do the unthinkable for Maiden: airplay on US radio. For the lyric, I flipped the story of Icarus on its head and made the father the villain of the piece. Driven by ambition and ego, he forces his son to fly, with terrible consequences as his son, in youthful exuberance, flies too high and his wings melt. Basically, the pushy parent revisited. One of my favourite songs on the album is Still Life. Atmospheric and dark, it deals with themes familiar to many of Steve's songs: fear, powerlessness, betrayal, and inescapable prophecies. Unless I'm very much mistaken, Iron Maiden don't do love songs. The closest any of us get is melancholy or anger at lost love or love destroyed. Closet psychologists, eat your heart out. Anyway, we now had some great songs, but what were we going to call the album? Basically, we have Eddie to thank for the name. Eddie is Iron Maiden's mascot, monster, alter ego, call it what you will. Part supernatural, part primal, part aggressive adolescent, Eddie is a super anti-hero with no backstory. Eddie doesn't give a fuck. He just is. Eddie also gets us off the hook as individuals. Eddie is far bigger and more outrageous than any badly behaved superstar. Eddie makes rock stars obsolete. This comes in handy when you get to your late 50s and rather fancy a quiet night in after playing to 25,000 screaming metal fans. Eddie can take care of the after-party, probably by disemboweling them and eating their brains, which is often more than they deserve. He'd become an onstage superstar during The Number of the Beast, all down to a bit of lateral thinking from Dave Lights, our, lighting engineer. He'd seen some giants on stilts at an opera and asked if he could commission the building of a giant walk-on Eddie. I remember the unveiling at the Rainbow Theatre. The roller shutter went up and there was a gasp as we beheld the giant. We realised right then that this one piece of theatre was going to be transformative. We could upstage just about anyone on the planet by having our gory ghoul amble on stage for 30 seconds and bob his head around. Until then, Eddie had been a rubber mask on a human wearing leather jacket and jeans. Mr. Smallwood was quite effective in costume and denied all knowledge, although actually he was very good at frightening small children. The giant walk-on Eddie opened up massive stage possibilities, and one of them was to remove Eddie's brain on stage. The heart didn't feel like the right thing to do, and by removing his brain, we could consign him to a straitjacket. The beast on the road had been shackled, lobotomized, and put in a padded cell. This all seemed to be a promising album cover. The top of his skull was velcroed in place, and the skull casing filled with women's tights stuffed with chunks of foam, stained bloody brown. Ripping out his brain actually looked more like pulling out several feet of pork sausages, but the thought was there at least. The photo for the gatefold sleeve features the band seated around a banqueting table regarding a large brain, which we are clearly about to consume. The working title for the album was Food for Thought. It was a pun, but not a very good one, and, as is often the case, the answer came one Sunday afternoon in a pub called the Mermaid, just by Jersey Airport. Why don't we call it Peace of Mind? Oh, no, that's peace, as in P-I-E-C-E of mind, not P-E-A-C-E. The artwork was sensational, and who cared if it was nothing to do with any of the songs on the album, although we did slip in a reference to Peace of Mind during Still Life, and the final twist came one evening while watching Omen 2 in the TV room, full of band and crew. As the credits rolled, there was a scrolling verse from the Book of Revelations with the line, "Neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things have passed away." I was rather hoping that a bit of tampering with the Bible might provoke yet more controversy. The number of the beast had generated plenty of hot air from the waffling middle classes and religious bigots, so we hoped for a bit more. I'm sorry to say it didn't work. No one seemed to care that there shall be no more brain, for the former things have passed away. Our adulteration of the Book of Revelation went unpunished, but it made us chuckle a little. The great roller coaster hurtled on and deposited us in the very much sunnier climate of the Bahamas to record the album. Making records in a tax haven was beginning to sound a bit Rolling Stones, but we soon put a stop to that. In the early 80s, drug trafficking was ravaging the island, and while out by Compass Point Studios life seemed suitably laid back and beach hut friendly, there were places in the capital, Nassau, that were potentially unfriendly. Cruise ships docked and boatloads of either elderly or drunken crazed college kids descended into town at regular intervals. There was still an air of faded colonial splendour, and the British ex-colony just about vied equally with the new American economic colony in a contest for the hearts and minds of whatever remained of island culture. It still resembled the island where Sean Connery filmed Dr. No, even if the bauxite mine, which doubled for so many other locations in that and subsequent Bond movies, had been dwarfed in economic significance by the arrival of bags of cocaine and hash. Up the road from Compass Point Studios, along the beach, was the Traveller's Rest. It could have been pulled straight out of a Hemingway novel. Concrete tables, black-eyed peas and rice, conch fritters and smudder grouper were all on the menu. The cool, damp evening breeze flowed through the open windows, and the only entrance was a pair of Western saloon-style swinging doors. The deadliest concoction on offer was a banana daiquiri of such quality that it rendered you both potent and impotent at one and the same time. The band all lived and slept in small, neat townhouses by the beach. Only a few yards over the road was the studio. Each townhouse had 3 bedrooms, and the road crew occupied the spare rooms. In the evening, the waves broke gently on the beach with a peaceful whoosh. My small house had a downstairs balcony with the sea below it. The reef was several hundred yards out, and the water was clear. Being close to the equator, the sun rose and set at very similar times throughout the year. If in any doubt as to what time it was, I just had to wait till the Stingray flapped lazily past my balcony every day at 4 p.m. At night, small ticks nibbled away at us. The locals called them no-see-ums for obvious reasons. Sea snakes cavorted around in the shallows, and dogs were potentially rabid, so best avoided unless you knew the owner. The one exception was a delightful little mutt called Biscuit, who belonged to our neighbour, Robert Palmer. More of him as the story unfolds. Now it was time to do some work. The studio was spacious and comfortable, but with a few eccentricities. Island power was sometimes unpredictable, so there was a backup generator. All well and good, but the power spike when the generator kicked in would send a surge through the magnetic tape heads of the 24-track recorder, erasing or damaging whatever content happened to be in contact with the head at that moment. A power cut was therefore a critical moment. The room would suddenly plunge into darkness, and tape operators would lunge for the recorder to pull the tape away from the heads. You had about 10 seconds to do it before an entire swathe was wiped from the tape. Except when it came to the power supply, we took our time. Rod had decided to go for broke in the USA and had gambled on us being able to do the business as an arena headliner. Social media did not exist. It was radio that ruled the roost, and if we could get a radio track away, we were home and dry. Hard work and touring would do the rest. I told him that Flight of Icarus was the one. When we recorded the track, I had a stand-up row with Steve over the tempo. He wanted to play the whole thing much faster, almost like a slow shuffle. I stood nose to nose with him, and he reluctantly caved in and let me dictate the timing. "This is nothing to do with getting it on the radio, is it?" he demanded. "Oh, good God forbid, of course not," I lied. Well, we did it, and it was a top 10 radio hit out of the box. As it happens, I think it's the right tempo regardless, but I'm sure Steve would disagree, because we haven't played the song live for 30 years. The Trooper was a monster, and the galloping bass line and iconic sleeve was like red meat to hungry wolves in Europe. Revelations occupied the space normally taken up by a song like Children of the Damned, and for reasons of musical insecurity, I sported a guitar to play the opening lighter passages. I was not exactly overconfident playing in front of several thousand people, and I'm pretty sure that whatever I played was never actually broadcast to the audience on the grounds that it might have been crap. The laid-back rhythm of island life soon ceased. The hard grind of another world tour lay ahead. The UK was carpet-bombed from Hull to Southampton with shows, Europe similarly. But the big event was the headline tour of America and Canada. Chapter 17. Organ Pipes. Singing is hard at the best of times, and doing it with a band like Iron Maiden posed some unique challenges. The vocal strain was intense. We'd never given very much thought to vocal monitors, and the longevity of my voice was never considered as a limiting factor when booking the grueling tours. With the kind of singing I was doing, it was inevitable that my voice would fail. The closest analogy to a singer losing his voice is a football player breaking his leg. He may never play again, and the voice is such a precarious instrument that similar emotions prevail. Simple vocal strain can be dealt with by rest and silence. Living like a monk goes with the territory. More critical is disease, and singing while carrying a vocal infection like laryngitis can be career-ending stuff. The pressure on singers in these situations is unrelenting and often self-inflicted. Of course, you want to do the show, and the guilt involved in cancelling is enormous. Managers, agents and the like are often unsympathetic at worst and neutral at best. Thankfully, it hasn't happened too often over the years, but the work rate and lifestyle for the first 5 years meant that some degree of incapacitation was bound to happen. The best way to preserve a voice is to get loads of sleep in a quiet room with no air conditioning, just an even temperature and good humidity. Preferably take regular rest days and avoid unnecessary speaking and especially shaking hands with lots of strangers. Absolutely the best chance of catching colds and flu. Have an even and unremarkable diet with plenty of fresh vegetables, avoiding too many dairy products and other foods that produce excess mucus. Excess or sticky mucus is the death of the singing voice. The pathetically fragile vocal cords need only the tiniest blob to adhere to them, and the uneven vibration that results sounds like a piece of paper being played through a comb. Vocal polyps, essentially calluses caused by harshly rubbing the vocal cords together repetitively, as in shouting for days on end, are permanent manifestations of the same phenomenon. A German opera singer wrote a treatise on the subject of phlegm, in which she identified more than 50 types, almost as many words as the Eskimos have for snow. It goes without saying that drugs of most description are eventually fatal to the voice, especially ones like cocaine and speed, which are snorted into the delicate mucosa in the sinus cavities. Cigarettes and hash appear to work for some people, but certainly not for me. Lucky if you can survive the onslaught, but how lucky not to do it at all and sing even better. The vocal cords are only the start of the process. My style of singing is very physical, and I'm drained at the end of a rehearsal. My belly aches, my head hurts, and my eyes feel like they want to pop out of my head. The diaphragm is the engine room of the voice, and singers breathe in a way more familiar to people who meditate or do yoga. Very seldom will you observe the shoulders of a good singer rise up when he takes a breath. Indeed, taking a breath may be almost imperceptible. This is because the singer has trained his lungs and belly to relax and be inspired by simple air pressure from the atmosphere. If the body is relaxed, the lungs simply fill up. The interesting bit is that most of the lung capacity is located well below the nipples in the lower back. I'm the king of the elastic waistband as a result. Restrictions around the belly are extremely uncomfortable and lead to inefficient production of wind from the diaphragm, the bellows of the body. Singers train their diaphragm to become stronger and train themselves to stand with their lower back slightly flattened to permit maximum expansion of the lung cavity. Eating before a show can thus be a very uncomfortable, even hazardous activity. Once the diaphragm has metered the amount and velocity of air going through the pipes, the vocal cords add the note to be sung by stretching or relaxing, much like a reed in a clarinet mouthpiece. That's not the end of the story. The raw data note now arrives at the base of the tongue, which shapes and echoes the sound, moving and directing it around the resonant cavities of the soft palate and the hard, bony spaces of the sinus cavities. With practice, singers find their own sound from within the shape and space of their own bodies. The ground rules remain the same, however, and if you choose to make your idiosyncratic vocal style by vocal abuse, just make sure you know the rules before you try to bend them. That way you stand a chance of having a voice that will survive more than 5 years. A voice is, after all, just that. It's a voice for a story, a way of making people feel something, and, to that extent, the end justifies the means. After this brief description of what goes on, you're probably wondering how we got beyond our first vowel sound without a college degree. Fortunately, there are babies to teach us. We've forgotten how to be babies, to our eternal shame, but they make the most extraordinary noises, as anyone trapped in an aeroplane with one for several hours will testify. The vocal power that comes out of that tiny package is remarkable. Rock stars, of course, have long had the capacity to act like babies, but have not had the sense to sing like them. Chapter 18. Powerslave. The Peace of Mind tour was shorter than our previous one, only because the album took longer to write and record. We gambled in the USA and went for the jugular, headlining Madison Square Garden in New York. It paid off. Peace of Mind was us laying down the gauntlet to America. Even though we had a radio track with Flight of Icarus, it was clear that we would not last long as American media darlings because we were simply un-American. We disliked limousines and were more likely to be found playing darts than smoking crack. We despised fashion, hated the cult of celebrity, and thought the concept of all you can eat as disgusting as its obese participants. In contrast, Canada seemed much more sane, and ice hockey seemed to make much more sense than American football, at least at the time. We bashed our way round the States and the UK and Europe, and then Europe some more, and finally finished at a German TV festival in Westfalenhallen in Dortmund. It was the end of 2 years on the road. I had had herniated discs, a paralysis of my limbs, laryngitis, bacterial bronchitis, and a crash course in cultural assimilation. The bill at Westfalenhallen read like a who's who of 80s metal. Ozzy, Scorpions, Whitesnake, everyone was there. There were 2 stages at each end of a huge arena and a scaffold mixing tower in the centre. I remember being very tired, but the adrenaline kicked in The show was good, in that unsatisfying way that TV shows are good. Seldom are they actually really wonderful. TV kills live music. Cameras are the enemy, but people are your true friends. After the show, I got very drunk and abusive. I behaved appallingly. I was swigging from a bottle of champagne as I climbed the scaffold tower to the mixing desk. A very earnest journalist asked me what I thought of the sound. I responded by pissing on the mixing desk. I was asked to leave. Unchaperoned and with my willy hanging out, I interrupted a photo session of Quiet Right and inserted my dick into the singer's ear, thus becoming a new member. I was escorted from the building and placed in a car, with the driver given instructions to put me to bed. Unfortunately, I was in the front seat, which was bad for him, as I insisted on selecting reverse gear when he was at traffic lights. After I attempted to open the door at high speed, I was escorted from the front of the vehicle and put in the back, where there were child-proof locks. Who said we had forgotten to behave like babies? Peace of mind had given us a new confidence and a desire to break out of the angry East End punk metal identity that we'd been saddled with by the media and which we never were. Fierce, yes. Punk, never. And East End, well, that was almost true. I'd been busy fencing away and was taking lessons from the British national coach, Brian Pittman. His son, Justin, happened to be a friend of mine, and he also placed 4th in the World Under-20 Championships alongside future world champions. We became sparring partners, and a certain amount of drinking was involved. Fencing's a paradoxical sport. It has the appearance of some aristocratic pastime partaken of by a rich elite. This is a very convenient and lazy way of thinking, but since when has rigour ever got in the way of a good cliché for an idle journalist? The paradox in fencing comes in the conflict between availability and opportunity. It should be taught and trained in the toughest inner-city schools and not wasted on those who can merely afford it. That's not to say that it should not be inclusive, merely that the net should be spread far wider than it is at the moment. In many respects, it's similar to tennis in its requirement for dedication and individual coaching. It is, of course, a combat sport. The aim, in times past, was to kill your opponent, and sport had very little to do with it. I have a collection of old fencing books and books on duelling. There's no more lethal way to dispense with a human being, other than a firearm, than by running him through with a sword. I took my fencing kit with me on tour, and in every town we played, I tried to train and fight at the local club. It made a change from the rock and roll ghetto of the tour bus. I just turned up and fought, and then we went off and drank beer and talked about fencing, and very little about music, because nobody was bothered one way or another. I entered competitions if I could prize my way out of tours, and I still have some of the bizarre medals I won around the USA. On one occasion, I ended up fencing outdoors at the Renaissance Fair in California, amidst a crowd of pointy-hatted wenches and stout gentlemen wearing Elizabethan dress, shouting "Prithee" in a Californian twang in 100-degree heat. After I cleaned the cow dung off my kit, I was presented with a rosette that read, "For Valour." Errol Flynn, eat your heart out. Actually, I took lessons from the fencing master who taught Errol Flynn and who doubled for him in several movies. Ralph Faulkner also taught Basil Rathbone and Stuart Granger, I think, and well, pretty much anyone in Hollywood. He had his own studio, Faulkner Studios, out in East Hollywood, in what is now a low-rent district. He must have been well into his 80s and still teaching. Drumming and fencing have much in common. Both require tempo, but the combat element requires timing, which is quite different, but reliant on tempo. Timing is the ability to deliver the punchline, as in, the secret of a good joke is, wait for it, timing. In the space between people's intentions, or the space between successive actions, there is time to strike. It's like watching a great boxer effortlessly jab his way to victory, seemingly reading his opponent's every intention and being 2 moves ahead. Ralph wasn't very mobile, but his hand speed and precision were extraordinary. His hand moved as if guided by a preordained groove in the air, and I struggled to achieve the required accuracy to manipulate the point of my foil around the worn aluminium guard and onto the target, his weather-beaten brown leather plastron. From behind his mask, he barked commands. His voice was gruff, and it was quite difficult to understand. He would raise his mask and stare through the thick lenses of his wire-rimmed glasses. "How far?" I said. "Oh, yes," I'd reply. There was another club in LA run by former Japanese Olympic fencer Haizaburo Okawa, who was also a kendo champion and a bit good at golf. Not too much eye-hand coordination at work there then. I felt at home with fencers because they were nearly always eccentric, smart, and liked a beer. My biggest problem in trying to improve was a lack of consistency in training and coaching. You simply can't get anywhere without a solid input from a proper coach. We would all be back in Jersey shortly to write the next album, but coaching was limited on the island, so I made plans to import my buddy Justin to spar with. The doomsday clock kept by nuclear scientists was ticking at 2 minutes to midnight. That sounded like a song title. Ronald Reagan was expounding about the evil empire of the Soviet Union, and just for shits and giggles, Steve threw in an epic song recounting the rhyme of the ancient mariner. In an ironic touch, I wrote the song Powerslave as a partial allegory of life as a rock star pharaoh, taking all the acolytes with him as he goes. In the end, it's all just an empty tomb, so what was the point of it all? Bleak magnificence was the sentiment in my heart, and it was starting to become what I would feel at the end of the tour, a slave to the power of death. The song started life as a little Egyptian-sounding riff on a guitar, and I always loved the image conjured up by the phrase slave amplifier. A bit of daydreaming and staring out the window on a rainy day did the rest. The song gave us our album title too. What Powerslave really did, though, was give us the gift of Pharaoh Eddie and the magnificence of the Powerslave stage set. Suddenly, we had a walk-on Eddie mummy plus a giant mummy that rose from the back of the set in a stunning finale. The theatricality was sensational. For Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, we turned the same stage set into an old galleon. This was old school, painted backdrops, trompe-l'oeil effects and props. It was proper theatre, rather than insubstantial gimmicks. It was theatre of the mind. When we came to make a video for 2 Minutes to Midnight, the director was keen to show how cinematic his storyboard was, so he met us to show us Polaroids of locations. The Greenwich Foot Tunnel was one of them. It brought back memories of college and walking under the river to catch the bus to the Green Man in Plumstead. He then produced a series of drawings describing the mercenaries' hangout. "We found this fantastic location. It's disgusting, full of rats and piss. Horrible," he said. He flipped over the Polaroid. "I used to live there," I muttered. It was 22 Roffey House. How the world turns. Chapter 19. Iron Curtains. Returning to the Bahamas to record Powerslave seemed almost like coming home. Although we all had homes, none of us had actually spent any significant time in any of them for over 2 years. None of us could really comprehend that it would be another 2 years before any semblance of a normal existence began to impinge on us, and even then, only briefly. We mixed the album in the city that never sleeps so good they named it twice, New York, New York. I love New York, and over the years, the city has returned the favour. It's a daydream of cinematic proportions, and it's in the smallest details that it reveals itself. The patter of the cops, the hustle, the bustle, and the brash vulgarity that in any other city would be gross, but in New York it verges on inspirational. Early morning, winter's day, cup of coffee steaming out of a paper cup as the dust carts hammer their axles round the potholes. You are in the French Connection, and Popeye Doyle is going to step out of that office building right now. Or maybe not. I found a fencing sal, that's a club in English, run by a world-class Ukrainian defector. Stan was a hero of the Soviet Union in terms of sport and the national coach of the Ukraine. He'd smuggled himself out and managed to make his way to New York. He was an eccentric and industrious individual, and as well as running a fencing school, he had a business manufacturing and importing fencing clothing from around the world. I spent hours training every week. I would hop on the subway down to 23rd Street with my kit bag around 11 a.m, warm up, then have a one-on-one lesson for 45 minutes. Reduced to a small ball of sweat and goo, I would go to the local deli and bring my lunch back to watch as he gave lessons to the next batch of modern-day musketeers. A couple of hours of sparring, and that was me done for the day. Electric Ladyland Studios, where the record was being mixed, is tucked away in a basement in Greenwich Village, which was only a couple of stops down the street, or a pleasant walk. Take a listen back, have an opinion, and let them get on with it. Steve loved the process of mixing, but I preferred to leave them to it and come in as a second opinion. It's very easy to get too close to a mix, so that it becomes very hard to make an objective judgment. Later on, when I was in the middle of my solo career, I had to get more involved in the mixing process. Nevertheless, I would give guidelines and would always deliberately leave the crew alone to determine their own mix as they saw fit. You can't paint a picture if all you can see is what's at the end of the paintbrush. It's also very easy to get bogged down in technical minutiae, the creative equivalent of quicksand. With the mix done, we rehearsed for the upcoming tour in a wonderfully tacky nightclub in Fort Lauderdale and stayed in a cockroach-infested seafront motel. Soon enough, the holiday was over. It was time to emigrate to the evil empire, behind the Iron Curtain, as it was in 1984, to Poland to open the Powerslave tour. The Tupolev Tu-134 is a small twin-engine jet airliner, and it was the vehicle of choice to transport us to Poland. LOT Airlines was using all Russian machinery, and this was the variant that had a bomb-aimer's cupola in the nose, which was all rather thrilling. We were tucked into the cramped fuselage, festooned with netting instead of overhead bins, whilst unidentifiable meat products and boiled sweets were delivered by the cabin crew, whose morale could best be described as homicidal. Warsaw was forbidden fruit. We were received in scenes reminiscent of the Beatles when they landed back in the UK after playing Shea Stadium. We stepped off the plane, initially oblivious to the hundreds of Poles besieging the airport with banners, placards and albums. The welcome committee was cordial, relaxed, and the complete opposite of any preconceived notion we might have had of some Stalinist apparatchik or Stasi stooge organising our trip. We walked down the aircraft steps and shook hands with the promoter's rep. There were grins all round. We smiled, he smiled, the sun shone, and the heat wrinkled the air around the concrete apron. "Where's Rod?" the rep asked. Rod Smallwood had chosen this moment to make a bold statement. He'd purchased a white suit, although to this day Rod insists it was beige, and dark sunglasses. As the aircraft door opened, he surveyed the reception committee, who ignored him. We ambled down to the ground and chatted to everyone, but Rod stood on his own, suited and sunglassed. We had queried his choice of clothing when we boarded the plane. "I've got to show them who's boss," was his reply. I seem to recall none of us were too sure that a white suit would be the sort of thing to go down a storm in Warsaw. By the time we'd gone through customs and immigration, it was quite clear that the whole apparatus of the state had been infiltrated by Iron Maiden fans. Anyone with a gun wanted an autograph, and when we tried to get on the coach outside the terminal, it took all of my minimal rugby skills to batter my way through. On the bus, the subject of the white suit was broached. Rod was a little uncomfortable at not being the centre of attention for all the wrong reasons. I did, I confess, try to take the mickey. Rod had the unpleasant habit of striking people across the top of their head with his knuckles if he disapproved of the conversation. Record company execs lived in fear, but back in the macho man culture of the time, it was tolerated the same way females were ogled and touched up, and accepted it by gritting their teeth and mentally kicking the offender in the nuts. "Oh, shut up," Rod said, and reached out his fist to rap me across the top of the head. I grabbed his wrist. We locked arms. This was getting interesting. Finally, we wrestled ourselves onto the floor of the coach with Rod muttering, "Bloody hell, you're quite strong for a little bloke." After our undignified rotting, the white suit was white no more. Covered in dirt and dishevelled, it was never seen again. The Poles were sensational. For me, it also represented the first country that had never seen the band with the old singer, so everything was new to all of us. The shows went off predictably with barely a hitch. Such was the enthusiasm of the fans, and such was the palpable feeling of liberation in the air, that we could have stood on stage in our underwear waving white flags, and the reaction would have been the same. As we travelled through Poland, it was like reliving the past 40 years of history, from the horrors of Auschwitz to the grim and obvious failure of communism, and the slow but growing sense of a new future, somewhere groping in the distance. We'd been given the services of a very bouncy young chap, Joseph, who was to be our security guard for the duration of the tour. Joseph spoke very little English and had been trained to kill people in imaginative and unexpected ways by the Soviet military. He was a member of Spetsnaz, or Special Forces as we would call them. Luckily for us, Joseph was not inclined to execute or assassinate us, which might of course have changed if we suddenly went to war. Joseph was on permanent furlough after his parachute failed to open properly when he jumped out of an aircraft at 300 feet. The injury to his back meant that he was now put out to pasture, guarding decadent Western rock stars. After a couple of days, we turned him, and he defected to our way of looking at the world. Initially, Joseph's reaction to the glorious disorder whenever we arrived at a hotel was to kill them all. He carried a gun, not that he needed it, because, as he demonstrated one evening when turning out the lights, his feet never ran out of bullets. Instead of using his hands, he kicked forward and backwards at head height, and finally, with astonishing deftness, he flicked off the light switch with his foot. We explained to Joseph that the audience were actually our friends, and that we shouldn't really try to kill them because they were only trying to be nice. He seemed to take this on board, and over the next few days his English improved noticeably, even if his topic of conversation was more illuminating than we bargained for. Some of the crew had found some dope, and we persuaded Joseph to try some. The results were immediate and, I fear, long-lasting. Joseph stood on the bed, in very good spirits, and signalled for silence. "This is good woman," he said, squatted down on a virtual penis with two virtual willies in either hand, and with his remaining orifice stuck his tongue into the side of his mouth and sang the Blue Danube whilst moving up and down and side to side in admirably persistent rhythm. Very good, Joseph. Clearly there was a bit of work to do, but we were making progress. As we drove through the Polish countryside to the venues, he would point out landmarks. "There is secret military base." "MiG?" I inquired. "Yes, MiG-21. I liked Joseph. Actually, I liked all the Poles we met. The towns were, in general, quite depressing. We stayed in the upmarket hotel in Warsaw, but one drunken evening, I woke up in a Warsaw apartment, I know not where, with people I didn't know who spoke no English. It was my fault for drinking with Howard Johnson, a journo who was out to cover the show. We'd ended up in a car, been stopped by the police, and our chaperones had told the police we were Polish, and thus we ended up sleeping off our hangover and listening to their cassette tapes compiled from the radio. The bright sunshine was painful. We had a few zlotys, the country's currency, and we stepped outside to find ourselves in the middle of a high-rise housing estate. The buildings were drab and in poor condition. The queues for the tram or bus were building, and there were a few vendors with a horse and cart which had vegetables for sale. We waited for an hour or so before we found a taxi, and although we had no money, it was obvious that we were foreign, and despite our long hair, we wanted to go to Hotel El Posh. Just as well because the band was missing a lead singer for the show that night. The rest of the cities we visited were similar. We were taken shopping in a department store. There was precious little to buy. The building was little changed from its former occupation as the headquarters of the Gestapo. Some of the venues were sports halls, and in a fabulous folly, the Spodek was built to resemble a giant flying saucer. In Wrocław, we played the Centennial Hall, which was a chilling experience. In the vast hall, a red velvet curtain hung to cover the centre of the dome. The reason became evident. A giant stone iron cross formed a central plug which effectively kept the roof from collapsing. Backstage, there were spy holes built in the walls so that the Gestapo could observe the audience and presumably measure their individual enthusiasm for the Nazi floor show. It was rumoured that the tunnels beneath the building extended down almost 17 stories. The relics of Nazi Europe seemed to follow us around. We'd been in Jersey, itself occupied and fortified. Much of the concrete was still there, and the workers who died, some of them Poles, were reputed to have been buried in the walls where they fell. By far the most sobering and depressing manifestation of the ghosts of Europe's past was our visit to Auschwitz, where death was planned, orderly, and brutally, clinically inevitable. Genocide has lost its power to shock in our visually overloaded world. The Khmer Rouge, Stalin's purges, they all seem to blur into one. Genocide is going on right now somewhere in the world, but it's the innocent plight of a child about to die that cuts to the very soul, unless, of course, you've given up on that idea, exchanged it for just obeying orders. No birds fly over Auschwitz. It's as if the very soil contaminates the air with the stench of death and the evil of those who walked upon it and planned the horror. It is the banality of industrial execution planning contrasted with the screams of the gas chambers that's the true measure of the terror. That terror, I believe, is the secret fear that we may all be such monsters deep down. It makes me shudder even to think it. I cried a lot after the visit. I was angry and silent. Not until I drove into Sarajevo 10 years later, during the siege, would I feel that same intensity. Chapter 20. Snow, Leather, and Bondage. We left Poland with a documentary made, a Polish wedding attended, and a drunken version of Smoke on the Water, along with a newfound respect for vodka. Onwards, then, as the trucks rolled into the rest of Europe. Of course, we were all busted for drugs in Germany. Actually, we weren't. It was the great Iron Maiden drugs bust that wasn't. Asleep in my bed, there was a knock at my hotel door. "No maid service," I groaned. "This is the police." I opened the door. A very polite young chap in plain clothes showed me his ID. "We are looking for drugs. Do you have any?" No. "Do you mind if I take a look?" "No, go ahead." He very politely poked around my bags and said, "Thank you." "Excuse me, but what's going on?" "One of your truck drivers has been smuggling them in," he said. "We have 2 kilos of heroin plus weed. When we found him, he was so out of his brains he could not even stand up." Well, that was a big wow moment. I phoned the tour manager's room and looked down the corridor to see a bleary-eyed assistant tour manager being led away. I believe there was a half-smoked joint by his bedside. Never mind the drugs, that's a serious fire risk. I got dressed and went to the restaurant. Sitting in one corner, on the naughty step, were half the road crew, all paying small fines for possession of minimal amounts of dope. On the roof were police with binoculars. It was all serious stuff, until it wasn't. Whoever had alerted the police to the contents of the truck driver's cab had jumped to a few conclusions, and the police in turn jumped to a few of their own, all involving following the crew buses to their destination, which also happened to be our hotel. The truck driver had been driving all night and had the next day off, so to relax, he drank a fair amount of his minibar as a homemade sedative before going to sleep. Blind drunk, he was dragged from his deep sleep and was thus unable to explain that he was diabetic and he liked to bake his own bread. 2 kilos of self-raising is not to be sniffed at. Autumn turned into winter, and Europe turned into North America. We made landfall on the east coast of Canada, in Halifax. Interesting place, Halifax. We stayed for several days, preparing the show, and I ended up advising a budding dominatrix on the building of her dungeon. By day, she was all crimpling slacks and a very professional radio promotions girl, and by night, it was all ball gags, rubber, and whips. Not that I indulged. I was merely shown the catalogue after our vanilla amorous encounter. What do you think about the stocks? She asked. Oh, very nice. Is there any other choice of colours? I asked her how she had become so enamoured of S&M to want to build her own dungeon. Travelling salesman, she replied. It turned out that Canada was awash with S&M travelling salesmen, all carrying their kit in a little briefcase, like Freemasons. I suppose all those dark winter nights have an effect on the soul. As the Icelanders say, "What do you do in summer? We like to fish and we like to fuck. And what do you do in winter? In winter, fishing's not so good." I took the train to Quebec City, which took a bloody long time. I discovered that there are only two types of tree in Canada, those standing up and logs. That's all there is to see, apart from snow. We were heading west in winter, and the further we went, the colder and colder it got. Toronto was almost tropical by comparison. And this, my friends, was where I met the mighty Johnny Cash. We were doing our sound check at Maple Leaf Gardens, and I noticed 5 guys sitting among the empty chairs at the back of the hall. "Who are those guys?" I asked. "That's Johnny Cash's band." I wandered backstage after we finished. The area was strewn with ice hockey detritus and rubber floor tiles. Standing above it all was a leather greatcoat-clad giant with thigh-high leather riding boots. He extended his hand and shook mine. "Hi, my name's Johnny Cash," he said. "I wondered if you could sign something for my daughter. She's a fan." His voice rumbled and resonated, but not in a loud and brash way. He was a terribly humble soul, and the sheer size of the man made him more impressive because of it. All I could think of was, I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. "Yes, of course," I said instead. "Very fine boots." "Yep, had 'em made in Texas." I signed a photo, and he passed me a promo photo of himself, playing pool, entitled The Baron.